This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
Chapter 8 deals with organisational culture. And Charles Handy is a very nice definition of culture that's here on the screen. It is the way we do things around here. And we've all been affected by organisational culture. We're all sensitive to it. We will have come across it, for example, if you moved school, when you went to college first. You will have been sensitive to it when you maybe move jobs and go to a different employer. In a way, you go carefully for a little while as you find out how people do things around there. You need to find out, for example, maybe how people dress for work, whether it's always collar and tie or whether it's less formal. You need to find out what they call each other, whether it's Mr. this and Mrs. that, or whether it's first names. You need to find out, if official hours are 9 to 5, exactly how long do people stay there? Do they habitually stay till 7 or 8 at night? What is, the actual way in which people are going to be working? So this is all to do with the culture of the organisation, and the cultural web suggests influences or, I suppose, mechanisms in which the culture is really defined. And first of all, we have symbols and titles. So in some organisations, the top directors, the top managers, they're always in separate offices. And sometimes even to get to see that manager you have to go through a kind of secretary and then you might see that manager. Sometimes in the car parks there are reserved parking spaces for directors or senior managers. These are symbols or almost titles of your position. In American organizations there are vice presidents all over the place and so on. I can remember in my early days of auditing going to a large manufacturing company, and they had 3 different dining rooms. They had one for the workers, if you like, one for the middle managers, and then one for the senior managers. And again, this was a kind of symbol. As you went up through the dining rooms, the food got better, and frankly, the stomachs got larger as well. People, by and large, maybe tend to be getting away from symbols and titles a little bit. They don't... They're less willing maybe to give respect to a manager simply because the manager is called a manager or the manager has a separate office and so on. I think people in many cultures, many national cultures, are less likely to be impressed by a manager who drives a big car. They might be more impressed by someone who knows more about the technicalities of the job. Power relations. Power relations, well, the easiest way to think of that almost is theory X, theory Y. In some businesses, the manager expects to tell you what to do and expects you to kind of obey it without any question. In other organizations, it's going to be much more participative, much more democratic, and the power relations are going to be very different. The manager will never tell you to do something. The manager will say, I think we should do that, what do you think, and so on. Organizational structure, we could maybe contrast a tall, narrow organization with lots and lots of layers and so on. That tends to give a very kind of bureaucratic, very kind of strict, hierarchical, almost military type of a feeling in the organization. Whereas wide, flat organizations with only a few layers in it tends to be much more egalitarian. You're much less frightened about talking to people at the top than you are in one of these narrow kind of structures. Control systems. How are subordinates controlled? And again, some organizations, they have timesheets and you maybe account for every half hour of your time or every 50 minutes during the working time. You will be clocked in and clocked out, so you're only paid for the time you work. There may be closed circuit televisions in the cameras in the ceiling, and they're watching what you're doing. It's very, very difficult to get any expenditure authorized. You have to get through all sorts of different managers to maybe get expenditure authorized for a business trip, something of that type. Other organisations are much more lax. Obviously, you need some controls, but they are maybe willing to extend more trust, if you like, towards employees, and to hope that the employees don't spend money or time somewhere where they shouldn't. Depends a little bit on the sort of business. If it's if you go back to Porter's generic strategies, if it's a business which relies on being a cost leader, then you can expect the control of costs to be very, very strict, very ferocious, really. If, however, it's a business where it relies on differentiation, giving a tailor-made, unique, better service to a particular customer who's going to pay for that, then you can't often at the same time have quite the same controls in place about what you're allowed or not allowed to do for that customer. The emphasis there is on pleasing the customer. Rituals and routines. Some places, it's almost trivial on one level. They expect you to bring in a birthday cake when it's your birthday and share it with your colleagues. If you don't do that, trivial it might be, you're going to be less popular than you might have been otherwise. When I was training to be an auditor, of course, during the week, you were always out at clients, you didn't meet a lot of your colleagues, but always people would kind of come back to the office on a Friday afternoon, getting to office about 4, leave their files there, pick up the new files maybe for Monday morning, and really everyone was kind of expected to go out on Friday evening from about maybe 5 to about 7, where you'd have social time with your colleagues and so on. Sometimes work was talked about, sometimes rubbish was talked about, but there was a lot of kind of informal communication going on there, and if you didn't play your part there, then there was a bit of awkwardness. Myths and stories. Myths and stories are often certainly emphasised and maybe exaggerated by management as a way of maybe telling people the way they're expected to behave in that organisation. So you could take maybe a firm of, let's say, management consultants or merchant bankers, investment bankers, something of that type, and they will maybe have a story where they heard about a takeover in place, or a client rang up on Friday afternoon saying, we're thinking of taking over this company, we need a report by Monday morning, kind of due diligence report by Monday morning. So what happened was nobody went home on Friday night, everyone kind of worked through the night, pizza was brought in to feed people. People only went home for kind of an hour on Saturday to have a shower and a change of clothes. They worked all through Saturday night and Sunday night. But my goodness me, we got that report out on time and the client was really pleased. So this is the sort of story, maybe partly mythical in terms of the hardships that people were going through, to instruct newcomers, if you like, that this is what's expected. Organisational assumptions, the paradigm there. Harder one to maybe think about, but the sort of example I'll talk about is maybe hospitals, and hospitals in the UK. Now, 50 years ago, there were fewer pharmaceuticals, much cheaper. There were fewer technical procedures that could be undertaken. MRI wasn't there, scans weren't there, there were fewer operations that would work, no heart transplants and goodness knows what else. Far fewer things you could do to help people, and therefore much cheaper. And the kind of assumption made then by essentially doctors in our National Health Service was that the health service can do everything it can for everyone who comes along. They will get the most up-to-date treatment because it could be afforded then. Now in the UK, our health service is under, shall we say, some financial strain. Not only are people getting older on average and therefore more call on health services, but there are more treatments, more expensive pharmaceuticals which are available. And now there's this idea that everyone can get everything is maybe being challenged, shall we say. And whereas doctors didn't used to think about money at all, the assumption was there's money for everything. Now doctors are having to change just their assumption a little bit and say, well, maybe we haven't got money for everything. Maybe what we have to do is to kind of prioritize treatments and have a slightly more, I don't know if profit and loss is right, but to look after the use of the budgets better. So maybe we can give the most treatment to the most people kind of approach. And there's been a very kind of subtle change maybe in the roles and assumptions that, say, doctors and health services and health departments and so on are making. Now, Andy said that after all of this here, you will end up with one of four types of culture. So these were the influences of culture, and these four here are kind of the kind of types of culture you can end with. So first of all, there was a power culture, and basically with a power culture, there is somebody there who is definitely the boss. And there is no doubt who the boss is, Probably the boss has got the same name as the company. Probably the boss started the company. And this person has all power. And none of it is shared. This person can tell anyone to do anything. There are very few internal controls around the place and so on. The advantage of this is obviously the boss started the firm. The boss may be very talented. The boss can make very quick decisions and so on. The disadvantages is you've got maybe all your eggs in one basket. The boss is not guaranteed to get things right. But also in larger organizations, if you still have this charismatic lead figure, there are dangers because many of the kind of financial calamities and frauds and so on which have occurred were because there was a charismatic person at the top who would tell people do this and they would just do it because they were simply used to doing what the boss said. They would never question the judgment. As businesses grow, it's harder for the boss to keep a finger in everything. And usually the way they evolve, if they're allowed to by the boss, is to become a role culture where you have really split up into usually different departments of functions and people have a role. So you've got the accounting department, the manufacturing department, the sales department. Within the accounting department, you've got the finance director, the chief accountant, the person in terms of the receivables ledger, the person in charge of the payables ledger and so on. And people are given a role to, and usually with the role, there is a job specification. Remember we talked about job specification that defines what your job is. It can be very efficient. People are going to be probably doing the same job over and over again, so they get quite good at it. Where it begins to break down a little bit is when people are asked to do something which is slightly outside their job spec. So if say a colleague was ill, and I was asked to take on some of that colleague's work because maybe good relations with customer depended on it, I might be tempted to say, no, that's not my job. It's not my job specification. My role is something quite different. So people began to run into trouble with this when competition and customer demands and technology began changing more rapidly. People stuck in their and defending their role and their role culture became quite difficult to get them to move quickly enough to stay competitive. The task culture there, the attention not so much to job specification, but to get the job done. There'll be an emphasis there that we are all dependent on pleasing our customers, pleasing our clients, and what's important is for us all to pull together to try to get the job done. And if my colleague is absent, provided I have the skills, I would cover for them just to please that client. Obviously, you don't want people doing tasks which are not suited for at all, or roles which are not suited for, but there's much more emphasis on the outcomes and keeping your staff, keeping your clients happy. The person culture is an odd one. You don't come across it very often. You have to kind of work hard really to maybe think of a person culture. It's really where a person is kind of pursuing their own ambitions and preferences, They have to do it within the context of an organization, but they're not really interested in the organization. An example might be a talented surgeon in a hospital. You can imagine how this person, quite technically orientated, very, very good, but maybe all they're interested in is doing the operations. They're not that interested in thinking about the money or thinking about the organization of the hospital or partaking in any other part of the management. They just want to go into the hospital, do their operations, because that is where they get their reward from, and kind of go home. You kind of come across it sometimes also with people who are very engaged in information technology, and they just want to come in and do their coding, maybe not hardly even talk to anyone, kind of go home at the end of the day. So they're nearly standing apart from the culture of the rest of the organization just a little bit. Shine recognised that maybe there are 3 levels of culture. You just need to know what these are. He said that the obvious things at the top, the artifacts, like, do people wear a shirt and tie? It's implying there's a very kind of formal culture. How easy is it to get something authorised? That's a process. And again, if it's hard to get expenditure authorised, it's pretty obvious. And it's pretty obvious, again, you're dealing in a fairly kind of strict environment. There's something called espoused values, like we want to be the best or we want to give really good customer service. That's a kind of espoused value. And it takes you a little longer maybe to find that. It's not as obvious that giving really good customer service is really what the company thinks it wants to be doing or should be doing. And then we have the basic underlying assumptions here. I don't know why it says it twice here, but it says it twice. Basic underlying assumptions, the hardest one. This is really what makes a business tick. So is the basic underlying assumption of a hospital to break even, in other words, not to go into deficit and so on, is the basic underlying assumption of a hospital maybe to make profits, as it is in some countries? Is the basic underlying assumption about the purpose of a hospital nothing to do with money, but just to make people better, and they're not really interested in the money at all? And these kind of assumptions here are often the most important parts of a culture, but they are deeply buried and may take the new person the longest to find out about them. And then finally on culture we have a guy called Hofstede who said how do nations really differ on their cultural attitudes, or the culture is likely to be found inside, say, an American company or a British company or a German company or a Japanese company or a Chinese company and so on. How do national characteristics perhaps play a part in changing the culture of these organizations? So national culture influences how people work and how they expect to be managed. And he said that countries differ in the following dimensions. First of all, power distance. And this is really to do with how commands are given or how instructions are given to staff. In countries with a high kind of power distance, the boss is quite remote, and the boss tells staff what to do, and that's kind of what's expected. This is the way everyone's kind of been brought up, in a fairly, I suppose, formal environment where you're very respectful of authority and you tend to do what you're told. Kind of naturally Theory X sort of society. In other organizations, if you go out and you try to dictate to people, just tell them what to do and say, I don't want to hear any arguments or discussion, just do it, you'll have a kind of rebellion on your hands. That staff will be unwilling just to sit back and do what you say simply because you're called manager. They will question your decisions. So that's obviously going to ride over into what the organization feels like, how they do things around there. Next, uncertainty avoidance. Uncertainty avoidance really is how the organisation and how its staff members are going to be affected by risk and what their attitude is towards risk. Some countries, employees, people, and indeed companies are expected to take risks. They're expected to try. In those countries, trying and failing is far superior to not trying at all. And America is often set up as a company where its industry is very, very vibrant. But there, the idea, that being an entrepreneur, trying to start up your own business, trying to make a go of it, is a noble pursuit, and you should try it. And even if you go bankrupt, you've tried it, and you can pick yourself up and you can try it again. There is no shame, if you like, in having tried and failed. Whereas other national cultures are much more hesitant. They don't have the same habits, I suppose, of trying to start up businesses, of taking the risk maybe, of going out and risking actually employing someone, maybe buying a machine and so on. And if they were to fail, then they have been kind of marked as a failure, and there's shame and embarrassment to deal with that. So employees and employers' attitude towards risk. And maybe we can see that in some of the control. Places where people don't like risk, they prefer quite tight systems of control. They like to have their manager authorising what they do. So if the manager authorises what you do, then there's less risk for you. Whereas in other organisations, they would prefer to be given maybe an expenditure budget, almost a kind of management by objective sort of thing. Here's your objectives. Now it's up to you to get on with it. You kind of sink or swim, but it's you're the person who's in charge of hitting those objectives. And individualism, collectivism. In some countries, people like to pursue objectives really for themselves, very individualistic and so on. They would certainly disagree with the majority if they wanted to. They wouldn't kind of sit and wait to see what other people had said. In other organisations, there's a much more feeling we want consensus. We don't want anyone to come out with a different idea or a different approach or something which may unsettle the other people in the organisation. It's much more of a collectivist sort of a decision they'd be kind of interested in. And then finally there is masculinity, femininity. A masculine type of culture tends to be one which is maybe fairly based on numbers, which is fairly kind of right, wrong, yes, no sort of an attitude. Not seeing too many greys between the yes and the no and so on. Maybe if somebody fails, could be quite tough on those people. Sees business very much as a, quite a tough game where there are definitely winners and losers. Whereas in a more feminine society, people are not just worried about the winning and losing. They've also got a concern for people. So like in the Blake and Mouton managerial grid, we had concern for people, we had concern for the task. In the more feminine situation, okay, there's still concern for the task, but they will take people's preferences into account, people's ambitions into account, people's difficulties perhaps into account when they're managing these individuals.
This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.